The planet stretched out beneath a sky choked with ash and dust, every inch a reminder of abandonment and decay. The girl moved through it all, her form lean and sharp, shaped by years of survival in a place that had long since forsaken hope. Her people, once vibrant and proud, had dwindled to nearly nothing. The few survivors lived scattered, hoarding remnants of the world that once was. For her, it had always been about survival. Life here wasn't meant for dreams or wishes, only enduring one day to make it to the next. Every morning, she left her shelter to scavenge, picking through wreckage, ancient machinery, and dried-out wells in search of anything useful. Her fingers were rough, her body agile and honed. But even she couldn't shake the weariness that crept up with each passing day. This was existence without purpose, life without light. She knew that, one day, her body would simply fail, and she would become just another part of the desolate landscape. It was the way things were, and she had long since accepted it. Then, she saw it, a flash in the sky, a speck trailing smoke, spiraling down toward the far hills before it crashed. Her heart thudded, a feeling both unfamiliar and jarring. A crash landing meant wreckage, supplies, maybe even food if she was lucky. But as she climbed to the peak of a nearby dune to look down on the smoking wreckage, she saw something she hadn't expected: movement. Amidst the torn metal and smoldering debris, a figure struggled to stand. Tall, clad in layers of worn, dust-coated gear, with a helmet that caught the faintest glint of the ashen sunlight. A human. She felt a jolt of something deep within: anger, fear, confusion. Her people had spoken of humans, of their ruthlessness, their appetite for conquest, and the cruelty that came with it. It was said that humans were the reason her people were left here to die when alliances crumbled and help stopped coming. She kept her distance, crouched behind a pile of rock and sand, observing him. He limped, clutching his side, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't seem dangerous, but she knew better than to trust appearances. Humans were clever. Deceptive. Yet, as she watched him struggle, her mind weighed the risk against a flicker of curiosity she couldn't ignore. Against her better judgment, she crept closer, staying low, every instinct screaming at her to keep her distance. But he was clearly injured. She could see it in the way he held his body, the careful, guarded steps he took as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. The usual wariness in her heart faltered, just slightly. Just then, he looked in her direction, his gaze passing over her hiding spot, unaware. She froze, her heart pounding against her ribs. He took another step, stumbled, and fell to his knees. She could hear the labored breaths he took, the way he exhaled, as if each breath drained what little strength he had left. Something tugged at her, a feeling she had buried long ago, a glimmer of empathy that she'd long since cast aside in the name of survival. She watched him struggle, unwilling to leave him, but not yet daring to approach. Hours passed. She watched as he fought to remain conscious, his eyes unfocused as he glanced around, trying to gauge where he had landed. Hunger gnawed at her own stomach, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. Finally, as dusk began to cast long shadows over the barren landscape, she made a decision. Moving slowly, carefully, she approached, her steps barely audible against the sand and stone. He noticed her, his body tensing as she drew closer. She could see his hand twitch toward a pouch at his side, but he stopped, perhaps too weak to pull out whatever weapon he might have hidden. For a moment, they just stared at each other, two figures in a wasteland of ruin, each wary, each alone. Without a word, she reached into her own pouch and pulled out a small ration, a dried piece of plant matter she had scavenged weeks ago. She held it out to him, her hand steady but her heart racing. He hesitated, studying her face, perhaps trying to gauge her intentions. Slowly, cautiously, he took it, his fingers brushing hers. A fleeting contact, but enough to unsettle her. He broke the ration in half, handing a piece back to her. She stared at him, surprised. In her world, every morsel was fought for, hoarded, hidden. Yet here he was, sharing. The gesture threw her off balance, challenged her beliefs. Why would he do that? She accepted the piece, biting into it slowly, savoring the taste even as she watched him eat. Silence filled the space between them, heavy yet oddly comforting. That night, they sat in silence by the dim glow of a fire he managed to start with a small device from his gear. She watched as he worked, his hands steady despite the exhaustion that showed in his face. She realized, with a faint twinge of surprise, that he was as vulnerable as she was. As he stared into the flames, she saw something in his gaze she hadn't expected. Weariness, yes, but also determination. An unbreakable resolve, as though he carried the weight of survival with an intensity she couldn't fully understand. For the first time in years, she felt less alone. The silence between them was different now. It wasn't the guarded, tense quiet from the day before. It was the silence of two people trying to understand each other, without words or gestures, bridging worlds that should never have met. As the sun rose over the wasteland, she stirred first, glancing over at him where he lay, his face pale and drawn from the struggle of yesterday. He hadn't stirred all night, probably drained by the day's events, and she wondered if he'd wake at all. But soon enough, he did, blinking groggily, his hand going instinctively to his side where a bandage, hastily wrapped, held. For a moment, they regarded each other, either moving. She had no words for him, and even if she did, they wouldn't understand each other's languages. Still, there was an understanding that passed between them, a recognition of shared struggle, shared pain. She offered him another ration, the last she could spare without putting herself at risk. He accepted it with a grateful nod, and again, in a surprising act, broke it in half, pressing the smaller piece back into her hand. She wanted to refuse, wanted to scold him for his foolishness. But something about his insistence made her accept it. Over the next few hours, they fell into a rhythm, an unspoken partnership that neither had planned nor questioned. She led the way through rocky paths and ruined buildings, guiding him to places where she knew they might find shelter or a trickle of water. He moved slowly, wincing with each step, but he kept up, his eyes scanning their surroundings with a careful, practiced focus. Whenever they stopped to rest, he worked with his limited supplies, repurposing bits of metal and wire he found to repair a broken tool or fashion a makeshift weapon. She watched him with quiet fascination, noting the way his hands moved with skill and confidence, as if this was second nature to him. Once, as he was fiddling with a piece of broken machinery, he looked up and motioned for her to come closer. She hesitated, wary, but curiosity pulled her forward. With a few gestures, he tried to explain something, pointing to the device, then to a cluster of rocks nearby. She didn't understand at first, but as he repeated the motion, the pieces fell into place. He was making something that would help them signal for help, or maybe even capture energy from the harsh, dusty sun. The idea seemed absurd, nothing worked here. And yet, watching him, a flicker of hope sparked within her. The days turned into a blur. They covered ground, she showed him paths hidden by the debris of her fallen world, and he taught her things she had never known could be possible. They scavenged together, and though their progress was slow, she found herself feeling something strange, a lightness, a purpose. With him by her side, the wasteland felt a little less empty. Once, as they sat by their makeshift camp, he began to sketch something in the sand. She recognized the figure, the rough outline of a mountain range, a star-dotted sky. It wasn't here, this was somewhere else, a place untouched by ruin. Earth, she realized. His home. Her breath caught, the beauty of it striking her in a way she hadn't expected. She couldn't imagine such a place, so full of color and life. And in that moment, she felt a pang of sorrow, an ache for something she had never known. He looked up at her, as if sensing her reaction, and offered a sad smile, one that said he missed it too. They sat in silence, the connection deepening in ways words couldn't touch. Over the following days, the connection grew. He began to share more with her, showing her items from his pack, photos, a small trinket, a worn badge. Each item told a story, a glimpse into a life filled with loved ones and memories. And though she couldn't understand the details, the essence was clear. He came from a world filled with bonds, family, and belonging, things she had long since abandoned in her mind. And for the first time, she felt the emptiness of her existence press in, the weight of years spent alone. But in his presence, Those feelings shifted, softened, became something she could face. One evening, as they sheltered from a sudden dust storm, he handed her a piece of fabric, worn but clean, motioning for her to cover her face. The storm raged around them, sand pelting their small shelter, and as she pulled the fabric over her head, she felt an odd sense of protection, of being cared for. She glanced over at him, meeting his eyes in the dim light. He nodded, a small gesture, but it filled her with a sense of warmth, an understanding that ran deeper than any language. Despite the hardships, the lack of food and water, the relentless heat, he never once complained, never once faltered. She began to understand that his resilience was not just physical. It was a force within him, a strength that seemed unbreakable. And as the days passed, she found herself drawn to that strength, relying on it as she had never relied on anyone before. Their bond grew, forged in the fires of shared survival, and she found herself trusting him in ways she had never trusted anyone. She learned to read his gestures, the small motions he made when he was trying to explain something or the way he tilted his head when he wanted her opinion. They communicated without words, their actions speaking louder than any language could. And in his presence she began to feel a glimmer of something she had not felt in years: hope. The day came when they stumbled upon an abandoned outpost, half buried in sand but still intact. As they explored, she noticed his face light up, a glimmer of excitement sparking in his eyes. He found a terminal, and though it was long dead, he tinkered with it, his hands working quickly, expertly, as if this was a skill he had mastered long ago. She watched, captivated by his focus, by the way he threw himself into each task with everything he had. When he finally got the terminal to hum to life, he grinned at her, his face lighting up with a joy she hadn't seen before. She felt a surge of pride, of happiness for his success, even though she didn't fully understand what it meant. And as they worked together to transmit a signal, to reach out into the void in the hopes that someone, somewhere, would hear, she felt a spark ignite within her. For the first time, she dared to imagine a future beyond this wasteland, beyond the endless cycle of survival. In the oppressive quiet that settled over the barren landscape, they found themselves moving forward, pushed by an instinct to survive, guided by a bond that had solidified without either of them fully realizing it. He led with a quiet determination, and she followed, each step drawing them deeper into the harsher regions of the planet. Food was scarce, water scarcer still, and the terrain stretched out with cruel monotony, offering no mercy and no respite. Together they forged a path, piecing together every shred of skill and every ounce of resilience they had. One evening, they encountered an unexpected threat, a creature native to the planet, silent but deadly, appearing from the shadows. The alien girl's instincts kicked in, and she moved fast, grabbing a sharp fragment of metal they'd salvaged earlier. But before she could strike, he stepped in, motioning her back with a calm confidence she hadn't expected. She hesitated, but something about his stance, the way he held his ground, made her yield. He scanned their surroundings, assessed the creature's movements, and with careful precision, he directed her to move slowly around it. Every motion was calculated, and she watched in awe as they navigated away from the threat without any confrontation. The danger had barely passed when she realized her hands were shaking. His too, though he hid it well, his eyes still wide, his breathing shallow. They shared a look, and in that moment, a wordless understanding passed between them. She'd seen others fight for survival, but she had never seen someone so calm, so resourceful in the face of such danger. There was a quiet strength in him, a strength that went beyond mere survival. It was as though he carried a core of resilience that nothing could break. The experience cemented something between them, a trust that ran deeper than words. As the days passed, their routines evolved, molded by the landscape and shaped by each other's strengths. She taught him how to spot hidden water sources in the cracked earth, an art her people had perfected over generations, and he picked it up quickly. In turn, he showed her how to fashion tools from nearly anything, using broken parts from his wrecked gear to create devices that, however primitive, made their journey slightly easier. She found herself marveling at his ingenuity. His resourcefulness wasn't just about surviving. It was about finding ways to adapt, to thrive even under impossible conditions. It was a revelation to her, the idea that survival didn't have to be bleak and devoid of hope. Once, when they ran dangerously low on water, he crafted a makeshift water filtration device. It was rudimentary, patched together with bits of cloth, hollowed out metal, and sand, but it worked. She watched him work with awe, feeling an unexpected admiration. To him, no challenge seemed too daunting, no obstacle too large. And while she had always been quick and skilled, she realized that her way of survival had been rigid, unbending. His adaptability was something new, something she began to strive toward in her own way. She could sense herself changing, shifting under the weight of this new perspective. Their shared purpose, once merely survival, evolved into a deeper mission, finding meaning, a spark of life, in a world that had long since lost its own. As they continued, she found herself drawn to his way of thinking, his quiet resolve, his unwillingness to yield to despair even when circumstances seemed insurmountable. He taught her that hope was something one could carry, even when it seemed irrational or futile, that it could be a force stronger than the physical hardships they faced. Despite their progress, the struggles of the journey wore them down. She saw exhaustion etch itself into his features, felt her own bones grow heavier with each step. One night, as they rested, he pressed a ration into her hands, motioning for her to eat. She shook her head, wanting him to take it instead, but he refused. The simple gesture made her chest tighten. It was as though he was giving her something more than food. He was showing her that care, even in the midst of desolation, could be as vital as survival itself. Their bond was tested again when another storm hit, this one fiercer than the last. They had taken shelter in a small cavern, the entrance barely enough to shield them from the howling winds. The storm raged on, louder and more violent than any she'd experienced before. As the sand whipped around, finding its way even into their makeshift shelter, she felt her heart pound, a primal fear clawing at her. She'd faced many storms, but this one was different. The planet, it seemed, was rebelling, lashing out as if to expel any remnants of life. He saw the fear in her eyes, and with a calm she couldn't fathom, he reached over, covering her hand with his own. His grip was steady, grounding. It was as though he was sharing his strength with her, giving her the courage to face the storm. She squeezed his hand back, feeling a surge of warmth in the midst of the cold, unyielding storm outside. They sat together in silence, neither speaking, but in that moment she felt something shift inside her. She realized that she had come to rely on him, not just as a partner in survival, but as a source of comfort, of connection in a world that had offered her none. When the storm finally passed, they emerged, weary but unbroken. Their faces were etched with dust and exhaustion, but there was a glimmer in their eyes, a spark that hadn't been there before. They were no longer two separate souls trying to survive. They had become a team, bound by a loyalty that went beyond mere necessity. She felt it in every glance, every silent gesture exchanged between them. In the bleakest corners of the planet, they had found something that transcended language, something that gave her hope in a way she had never thought possible. They continued their journey, and with each new challenge she found herself relying on him more and more, trusting his instincts, his wisdom. She realized that his resilience was not just a trait, it was a way of being, a defiance against the despair that tried to creep into every moment. And in his presence she felt herself growing, adapting, finding strength she hadn't known she possessed. As they walked through the barren plains and climbed over jagged rocks, she found herself thinking of his world, of the stories he had shared through small mementos and the drawings he'd etched in the sand. She wondered what it would be like to see Earth, to experience a place where life was abundant, where hope wasn't something that had to be fought for tooth and nail. And though she knew it was unlikely she would ever see it, the mere thought filled her with a sense of purpose. Their journey continued, marked by moments of shared laughter, of triumph over the smallest victories, and of silent understanding. Each hardship they faced, each struggle they overcame, brought them closer. She began to realize that he had changed her, not by force but by showing her a new way to see the world. And in that revelation, she found a new strength, a strength that wasn't bound to the desolation around her but to the bond they shared. Through him, she had discovered that hope, fragile as it was, could be enough to keep going, to face whatever lay ahead. As their journey neared its end, the quiet moments between them held a heaviness either could ignore. They had seen the worst of this planet, shared its despair, and found unexpected joy amid its ruins. Every step they took now was slower, each glance lingering, as if either wanted this journey to conclude. The signal device they'd crafted was ready, all that was left was to reach higher ground, their best chance to make contact. She knew that if it worked, if help came, this partnership, this bond that had become her lifeline, would likely end. The climb was steep, and as they scaled the rugged rocks, she couldn't help but steal glances at him, trying to memorize every detail. His face, drawn and tired but filled with an intensity she couldn't fathom, was a face that had given her hope, that had shown her what true strength looked like. They reached the summit, the highest point they could find, and he prepared the device, checking every connection with a focus that made her chest ache. She could see he was nervous, his hands slightly shaking as he worked, but he held himself with that same steady resolve that had guided them both here. Finally, he activated the signal. They waited, the silence thick with anticipation. She watched him closely, noting the hope in his eyes, the hope she knew mirrored her own. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. Just when she thought the silence would swallow them whole, a faint crackle cut through the air. His eyes widened, and he adjusted the device, his expression lighting up as a response crackled back through the static. He turned to her, his face alight with joy, and she felt a surge of happiness, mingled with an unexpected pang of loss. This was it. Their call for help had been answered. The next hour was a blur of preparations, a silent urgency pulsing between them. They packed what little they had, knowing they would soon be leaving this desolate place. As they moved, she felt the weight of what this meant settling over her. She realized that while he would be returning to a world of family, friends, and endless skies, she would remain here, bound by the silent, unspoken duty to her people's memory and her own fragile roots on this forsaken land. She had never allowed herself to consider any other path. And yet, the thought of watching him leave, of being alone once more, was almost unbearable. As they waited for the rescue ship, he looked at her, his gaze filled with a question she could see even without words. He gestured toward the horizon, to the vast unknown beyond, and she understood. He was offering her a place beside him, a way out of the world she'd always known. She felt a rush of emotion, a blend of fear and yearning. But as much as she wanted to go, to follow him to a world that held beauty beyond anything she could imagine, she couldn't abandon the life she had led, the place her people had called home. She shook her head, and he nodded, understanding, though a hint of sadness touched his eyes. The moment stretched, each heartbeat amplifying the quiet between them. He reached into his pack, pulling out a small, worn trinket, a simple keepsake, something that held a lifetime of memories. He placed it in her hand, his fingers warm against hers, and closed her fingers around it. She felt a strange ache, realizing this would be the last gift they shared. She wanted to give him something in return, a piece of herself, but she had nothing left to give except her gratitude, something she hoped he could see in her eyes. As the ship approached, a low hum vibrating through the air, she felt an odd sense of finality settling over her. They watched it descend, the light casting long shadows over the barren ground. He looked at her one last time, a soft smile playing on his lips. She managed a small smile in return, though it felt fragile, as if it might shatter at any moment. She wanted to say something, to find words that would capture everything she felt, but none came. Instead, she stepped forward and rested her hand on his arm, a silent farewell that she hoped carried everything she couldn't say. He held her gaze, his eyes reflecting a depth of emotion she had never known. Then, slowly, he turned and walked toward the ship, his steps echoing against the silence. She watched him go, every step pulling at her heart, a mixture of pride and sorrow swelling within her. She knew he was going back to a world that would embrace him, a world that would remember him. And she knew that her world, for all its desolation, would feel emptier without him. As the ship lifted off, she felt an emptiness settle over her, a hollow space where he had been. The light of the ship faded into the sky, leaving her alone once more. She looked down at the keepsake in her hand, tracing its edges, feeling the warmth of his presence lingering in its worn surface. It was a reminder, a silent promise, that though they were separated by worlds, a part of him would remain with her, embedded in the memories they had created together. She turned and began the descent back into the familiar shadows, her steps heavy yet filled with a newfound strength. The wasteland stretched before her, as desolate as ever, but somehow, it no longer felt quite as empty. She carried with her a spark, a sense of purpose that hadn't existed before. He had given her something far more valuable than survival. He had given her hope, a reminder that life could hold meaning even in the bleakest of places. As she walked, she held the trinket close, feeling its weight, feeling the quiet promise it carried. Her world might be one of ruin and solitude, but within her, a small, steadfast ember glowed, carrying the warmth of a friendship forged in the ashes. She knew that, though they might never meet again, his presence would live on, woven into her spirit, guiding her through the darkness that lay ahead.